What's good, everybody? Welcome to Origin Story, the podcast that interviews creators about where they came from to understand how they got here. My name's Phillip Russell, and I'm with my co-host,
Ben Thorp.
And today, we're talking to creator of Umurangi Generation, Tali Faulkner. Umurangi Generation is a photography game set in a futuristic New Zealand that's on the edge of an impending crisis that could end the world. And you're tasked with taking photographs, and throughout the game, you unlock a variety of lenses and other equipment to take the best photos possible. Really awesome game, and this was a really fun conversation.
Yeah, I think, Phil, you and I were both kind of drawn to this because the vibes in some ways are like exactly the thing that I think you and I are both drawn to, which is like you got a little bit of melancholy, you've got some mechs, you've got some big monster kaijus, and you've also got some thinking about like the end of the world and like what that means for you and kind of the people who are still surviving. And so I think a lot of that and a lot of those themes were just like immediately things that, especially for me, just like drew me right in. Tali has kind of talked about how this game is kind of thinking about lots of different kind of failures of government, whether it comes to climate change, whether it comes to COVID. The game, I think he talks about, is maybe directly inspired by the 2019-2020 Australian bushfires and the response or lack of response to those. And so I think all of that is just like stuff that was really kind of felt like a lightning rod of our interests in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and it was one of those games where for whatever reason during COVID, it felt like there were a number of games that were coming out that clairvoyantly grappled with some of the problems we were all experiencing at the time. Like, I think, we've talked about Death Stranding off air in the past and how that almost feels like this weird statement on an event prior to it happening. And in the same token, I think for me, especially being in Seattle, I started hearing about Umurangi Generation being described as like Evangelion vibes, which, if you know me, like huge nerd about Evangelion, so like that already puts it on the radar. But then also hearing this idea of like the Red Sky Generation, which is what the title of the game is referring to, and thinking about the fires that were happening on the West Coast in California and Canada and the Pacific Northwest. Here in Seattle, there was like a week at least where the sky was red and you weren't supposed to go outside. You had to wear like a gas mask because of the smoke. And the game just came at this really like coincidental time for me hearing about it, and it took a little ways to eventually play it. But I think I was really surprised to see just how prescient the game's themes were, even outside of the climate crisis. I think especially thinking about like neoliberalism and protest and activism. That was something that we talk a lot about to Tali in the conversation, and it really it was really eye-opening.
Yeah, and I think you and I have been talking about this, but like it's really interesting the way that politics are embedded into Umurangi Generation, and the way that it really worked for me. We talk about how kind of they're slowly kind of seated, they're in the background, they're in the environment, and this is, we should say, kind of a photography game. You're going around and taking pictures and slowly realizing that like something is deeply wrong with the world around you. And I think we had this conversation after Matthew Seiji Burns, and actually kind of with Matthew Seiji Burns, about his visual novel Eliza, where I was sometimes frustrated with the way politics weren't necessarily foregrounded in that they were kind of backgrounded. He really is kind of working to give you a sense of the machinations of the tech industry, but that's not forefront, right? Like, you're getting a lot of different perspectives, but he's not trying to out the gate tell you his thoughts on the tech industry. Is it bad? Is it good? And in some ways I found that kind of grating. And then here in Umurangi Generation, that worked for me. And I haven't quite been able to parse like why that is, and like why in this place it worked, but it doesn't necessarily feel like it works for me in the visual novel setting. And I'm like, is it something about like interactivity? Is it something about like how being able to move around a space and learn things a little bit more organically versus a novel, which is like telling you a story. I mean, I don't have the answer, but I'm noticing for me this like really different response to political messaging in like both of these games.
For sure. And I think, for people who aren't maybe super into like the gaming industry or kind of conversations that are happening in the industry, there's just so much talk lately over the last couple of years of like games that are clearly making political statements and then their companies being unwilling to say that their games are political, or like that they're commenting on any kind of political moment while still using the imagery, the ideology, or the circumstances of real world events. And I think that Eliza and Umurangi Generation are good kinds of touch points to be thinking about how, especially in the indie sphere, there are creators who are thinking about these issues and making statements, but doing it in different ways, right? Like I think with Eliza, it's almost like a landscape painting or an expressionistic impressionistic painting, where they're like, Matthew's giving us kind of different swaths of ideologies in the characters, but kind of allowing the player to come to their own conclusions. Whereas like Umurangi Generation, which we get into in the conversation, it's very much so like in your face. Here is what the ideology is. Here's what the political statements are and what the political moments are. And Tali doesn't, move away from those things. He actually kind of asks the player to lean in. So I think all of that was really interesting, and Tali does a good job of contextualizing a lot of those choices and how he was, creating the game.
Yeah. You know what? Let's get into it and let Tali speak for himself.
For sure. And I guess one thing before we forget, we wanted to congratulate Tali and the team. Umurangi Generation just won the grand prize at the Independent Game Festival, which is one of the biggest indie game awards in the world. So basically, the game is good. But you'll learn more about that ahead. So let's roll the clip.
Tali Faulkner is a Maori game developer behind Umurangi Generation, a semi-realistic photography game set in an apocalyptic future with mechs, an occupational United Nations, and the looming threat of the end of the world. The game recently won the top prize at the Freeplay Independent Games Festival. Tali, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, no worries. If you can all hear my voice, I have a very Australian accent because I've lived here for far too long. But yeah, I'm really happy to be on here. And, when Ben sent out the email, I was pretty excited because I think like this whole thing of talking about the people behind the games, I think it's a really positive thing to start to, endorse in this space, because I think far too often there's that idea of, magic elves or whatever making the games. And I think, the more we sort of humanize the development process, I think the more realistic the expectations are going to be. And I think it also just helped foster the industry's, creative direction, I think, away from more of that corporate-y space. But yeah.
Do you want to maybe just talk about the response that this game has received, which, at least from where I'm sitting, it seems like it's been overwhelmingly positive, and what that's been like.
Yeah, I think like, the thing I kind of think about is like, the response has been really positive, and it's a genuine positivity and an earnest one. Like, it hasn't been, I think, a one where people are, phoning it in or just trying to, I'm just sort of reflecting back on when I worked at a university, and whenever, Indigenous people would make things, you would sometimes get these responses from people who were like quite paternalistic, being like, "Oh, very good," and it's like, fuck off, like, and they're very clearly not seeing the point of something. And where I think with this, it was this really great thing where, especially, and I'm also a millennial, right? And it's this whole thing where a lot of other millennial players came in and they were able to really grasp the content because it was really, relative to them. And so like I think it's this whole thing where I'm really excited with the response, and I think the critical acclaim it's gotten so far is really cool. And, I think we'll probably see more players come in over the years, because I think at this point it's very much one of those games where a lot of people don't even say what it's about; they just say go play it, and like, I think that's part of the fun.
Yeah, and I'm glad you kind of touched on the way that the game works, because I think Phil and I have been really interested in the way the kind of story structure of games is kind of playing out. And with this game, it feels like it's doing such a great job of kind of slowly teasing things out in the environment. And maybe you can talk about easing players into these kind of deeper political themes, as opposed to maybe dropping, elements of the story in sooner about kind of anti-fascism or UN occupation. Why was it important to kind of do that slowly working the player into these kind of broader political concepts?
So like one thing I would say is that a lot of times when people are hacks at writing, they just sort of try to tackle the most common issue, and they'll breeze over that quite quickly with a judgment, I guess. Like the I'm talking more as like a broader, when people are trying to sort of make a political statement to, essentially make a product. Like, we've all seen sort of how brands and stuff have tried to, incorporate political whatever. But like, I think the best bit of advice I ever got was from one of my mentors when it comes to like doing, just looking at the beast of neoliberalism. Is one of my mentors, he used to say this idea of like, slow down and play. Like, go into that gray area and articulate it. See what's going on in that space. Slow down. You don't need to come out with a statement yet. Make some observations. Like one of the ones he used to always point out was this idea of, in the Australian nation state, there was always this idea of progress or change when it comes to Aboriginal issues and things like that. And what he did in that space is he used to look at that and go, actually, when you go and look at all this legislation, like on paper, the actual policies that have been written, the only thing that's really changed over the last 150 years is the wages officers get paid. The occupation premise is still there from the start. Once, you start to look at this whole thing of, okay, that's what's changed in the actual documents, and here's a way of like showing it out. It's really, I think, quite stunning the inaction that's happened in the nation state towards that stuff. And I think it's the kind of thing where with Umurangi, the idea was easing players in, but also doing that kind of thing where, with the world, it's all there from the beginning. You see the occupation status from the beginning. You see the, something's not quite right. But I think the thing about that is players aren't necessarily conditioned to see it yet. They don't have the context of knowing why jets would fly overhead, or, what are these giant, bronze buckety things that, and, when you come back, it's obviously it's a bullet shell, right? And it's this whole thing where that's part of the theme of the game around neoliberalism, where the, being able to ignore is there from the start. And if you are able to pick up on what's going on, you will see through and you'll be able to see what's coming. But I think, part of the idea of the game was to sort of, make that part of the gameplay and the environmental storytelling is that if you can't, if you're not paying attention, it seems like a, out of nowhere twist. But the reality is it's been signposted from the start. And I think the thing I've said a lot of times about that is kind of this idea of like, when the bushfires happened in Australia, there was warning for the previous 20 years around climate change. We all grew up probably seeing stuff on TV about, the greenhouse effect or climate change and stuff like that. Like, we all know this from when we were like 5, and now, 20 years later, it's this thing where those chickens have come home to roost, so to speak, and like, basically the idea of saying how could no one have predicted this is one of those things that happens in this. And we saw the same thing with COVID. I don't know, that might have gone a little bit off topic there, but I think there's ways you can sort of write this stuff in. And I think part of having bits in the game which are sort of reflective of the reality we live in, I think there's a way you can do that, which is like, one thing I kind of think about is like how certain so-called radical or progressive messages become normalized over time. And it's that whole thing where certain people will kind of say like corporations are bad, right? And that's become a very, I think, normalized statement. We all know that, right? We all know certain billionaires not paying taxes and things like that. But I think like, for a modern politically savvy audience, you've got to go a little bit further than that. Like you've got to I think, get a little bit more meat into that sort of like argument. You've got to talk about why, or you got to talk about, different elements of it. And so like I think slowing down and playing with those assumptions and ideas and things, and just articulating the thing and just figuring it out. And I think, for me, that's how I kind of want to approach this stuff in the future, because I think if you cast your net too wide, it's a little bit harder to make a strong point. Whereas like if you're just laser focused on something, you can really explore, what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in that answer that I want to unpack. Like, first and foremost, I really appreciate that perspective around play in relation to developing, whether it be a political message or a socioeconomic message or whatever it may be. I think that ethos really is shown in the gameplay of Umurangi Generation. I mean, on one level, it's kind of trite to say like, oh, it's a photography game, so it deals with perspective. Like that's kind of obvious. But on another level, I think the game does a really good job of through its mechanics articulating what you're saying of developing a perspective. So you go through these levels, you're kind of forced to find these objects or different things in the environment and take pictures of them, and in turn it kind of forces you to have your own perspective on what you're seeing and engage with the world. And like you said, the game uses messages like fuck fascism. I can't think verbatim, but like essentially like cops do harm or do violence, so fuck cops, fuck 12, all that, all that kinds of stuff.
And I'd say like with that stuff, because that, especially the final level of the DLC, right? Like when the game originally came out, that was 1 week before George Floyd was murdered, right? And with the DLC, Thor and I were like thinking, like we were planning to do like a little expansion pack, before the game came out, to sort of like, it'll give us like a little chance to address any issues with like the game or whatever. But like, with the DLC and especially that final level, it was about, being truthful, I think, to like what was being said in those communities, and like, not like, both sidesing or whatever, you know what I mean? Like that thing that a lot of these games usually do where they'll say, not all cops or something, right? Like with this, it was like, let's actually take the side of, the oppressed with this thing, and like let's use the language that is like being said right now, and I think there was like a lot of power to that, because especially with like a lot of the graffiti in that level, it was about like taking multiple angles or sides of it. I'm not saying having right-wing discourse that's saying that cops are heroes in there, no, but taking more of that thing where you saw different perspectives on how people were interpreting the protests. Like I'm thinking of there was the message coming out of community, from what I noticed, was usually that idea of like police stop coming to our community, killing our family, right? And that was a very unifying message, and something that I kind of like, for me, I sort of related that back to, with my family, 100 years ago, with the, British state coming in and killing family, to take land and stuff like that. But I think, there were also other things where, and we saw this if like you browsed Twitter all day like me, is, you'll see some people and they've got the more, anti-capitalist approach to it, or they'll have, this more, discourse centered in, online politics or, this kind of stuff. And I think part of some of those messages was to sort of, place them all together and say, this is like, this is what was happening. I think there are some that I definitely agree with, but there were some that were also said, and I'm not necessarily like, what's the word? The judge of whether or not it should be said or whatnot, but I'm going to put it there anyway to at least sort of let that message sort of be spoken for itself, and to put that in the game. And I think there's sometimes, and as I said earlier, like it's this whole thing of slowing down and moving it around and stuff. And I think sometimes the answers are not comfortable, but I think it's proper to sort of put them in there, but not distort them in a way that are going against sort of what's been said. But yeah, that and more from a $15 photography game.
Just one last thing about that kind of tangent. Just out of curiosity, one thing that I was kind of interested in was, again, just for the listeners, the main kind of mechanic of the game is photography. I'm curious, as somebody who like loves like mecha anime and things like that, I've always like kind of yearned for the show that kind of places the main point of view from like a civilian kind of outlooking like the event, or something like Gundam War in the Pocket, where you're kind of like in the little kid's point of view. I'm curious, like with Umurangi Generation, did the general conceit of the game start as a photography game, or
Yeah. So like, I think the original prototype that I made was, I mean, like I've said this a couple times, but it's like this idea of like, I wanted to just learn with Unity one thing and do that really well. So it was like, okay, how does the camera work in a 3D space? Okay, let's figure it out a little bit. Okay, we'll make a photography game. That way the gameplay is all focused really around the, how does camera work in 3D, and raycasts and line casts and whatever, right? And I think, for me, there was like, in relation to putting the mecha stuff in and the kaiju stuff in, it was sort of like, if it's going to be, a photography game, why not make it an interesting photography game and something that I like? Because, originally it was much more like, oh, you're just a courier and you're just walking around a town and, you're just delivering stuff, and it's, just going to be sort of, just scenery to take photos in. But I think, there was this whole thing where when I started to think about it like that, there was this whole like, oh yeah, what if like, you get to one area and it's just like, you walk down an alleyway and there's like an arm of a robot just sitting there, and the cops just like casually like, guarding the thing, hanging out, just like, just pushing you away if you get close and stuff like that. And I think it was this whole like light bulb moment where it was kind of like the whole thing of, and we're talking about base game, we're going to talk about DLC a little bit, but like, with that base game, it was this whole thing of like, oh yeah, what if like you were someone who was going through one of these, neoliberal collapses or whatever, with robots and kaiju and stuff? How would today's space react to that? And I think it was this whole thing we with like the bushfires that happened in Australia at that point, it was this whole thing where the tragedy was there, but so were the memes, if that makes sense. Like I think it was just that whole thing when like I just started to realize that this neoliberal system that responds to this stuff and responds to crisis, what if you just accurately portrayed how that would do that with a different boundary object? Instead of it being a bushfire, it's a kaiju, mecha thing, right? Tying that off and wrapping the knot around that was with this protest level saying the thing that is there to, which the government says is there to protect you, is now going to be the thing that tries to kill you, right? And, that's very much a look at, what happened not just last year, but this has been going on forever, really. And I think it's just one of those things where, like, what I mean about that is like, this sort of what would you call it, dominance mentality has been, it was one of the first things my family experienced when Europeans came to Aotearoa, and I'm sure, Philip, you probably have family stories as well that go back quite a long while where this is not a new thing at all. The tactics have changed, the technology's changed, but the ideas behind it are all still the same stuff that has been going on for, forever. And I think it's one of these things where I feel not dumbing that down and having that as a thing which is very, very much a like, this is the reality of this situation. I think that that lends it a strength that I think is very hard to dodge, and I think that was the point of the base game and this DLC. Like with the base game, the kaiju is very specifically this thing you cannot say does not exist. It's not a hypothetical or something that's very hard to see. It's a physical thing that you've seen in a level, less than 50 meters away from you. You've seen the terror, you've seen the destruction firsthand. And so when you go to the DLC and you see these, I guess like white neoliberals just sort of sitting in the space being so comfortable with their existence where they don't have to worry about any of it. And they've got, these little talking heads telling them that, oh, actually your life isn't that bad, stop complaining, don't criticize the government, like all this shit. When you see that and you've been through the reality of what they're talking about, you can see the absurdity of it. And, that was the point with those things, because that's the reality of, what's usually happening in these situations.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to get you to talk. You've said in a couple interviews that the Umurangi generation is this idea of the last generation, and I feel like I've been seeing people as in some ways, again, it's true to what you're saying, as I think climate change has begun to affect a lot of the kind of global north. You've seen this growing kind of realization to some degree that, oh, this is happening, this is going to happen. And then there's these questions about, what is the role of storytelling? What is the role of art if this is all going to end? And I'm wondering if you can maybe talk about how your game in some ways maybe speaks to that or answers that question. And maybe you can talk about how you think about that.
Yeah, I guess from a real cultural perspective, I would say that, the end of humanity is not necessarily the end of the world. Like in terms of, I think we'll pass on, but there will still be life here that, finally gets a break from us, right? Like, one thing I kind of think about is like when COVID happened, you had all these cities go into lockdown and you finally had a, blue sky in a place that had never seen one in, 50, 60 years, right? Now that's not to say I'm, an existential, dread kind of person where I'm saying we should all just die and let the earth recover. Obviously, I'd like to still exist. One of the things about the ending of the game is that you see these crabs on the headland there looking out, right? And, that's a story that sort of comes from where I am. And, it's this idea of, like, we sort of have the story that, the crab is very specific to that area because it's this idea of when humans are gone, the crabs will still be there. And they'll be the ones that'll, continue to sort of look after, the land there. But yeah, the idea around that is to say that, like, there will be a generation at some point who has to inherit all of the mistakes, right? They have to inherit everything that has caused the world to end, that subsequent generations that knew about it when they were young, and when they went to go and to assume those roles, continued to just keep the cogs turning towards the end, right? And I think, the thing I kind of think about with that is, like, you see these sort of younger politicians now getting into the space, and there's usually this immediate joy of, oh, finally we've got someone in here who can start to shake it up the system or fix it, kind of thing, right? And then one thing that me and some friends have always sort of noticed is there's that very cynical thing where you start to see that it eventually goes that they get rode back down to where they are now going to just accept the system. That's not me necessarily saying, we all get the pitchforks out tomorrow, but I think it's this whole thing of when you see that system do that over and over again, there's going to be a point where it can't do that anymore because it's going to end, right? And the young people who are going to have to sit by and watch it happen are going to be this final generation. That's what I think the point of this, Umurangi generation is. They're the people who, they could be us or they could be the Zoomers or something, but like they're going to be these young people who can see that it's screwed up, and by the time it's a giant kaiju, it's too late because you can't act on that. It's something that even these giant mech robots are getting absolutely scrubbed over because the problem is too bad at that point. And the example of that would be when it comes to these bushfires or climate change, or like, let's say for example this pandemic. Before we started the show we were talking about these variant strains and things like that. how's this system going to work when the strains are basically, there's 10 of them and they're all just as deadly as one another, right? And you have, this whole thing where it's all bad at that point, you know what I mean? And there's no fixing it. And I think the reality of that is you would see that this system will do what it always tries to do, which is to say, learn to live with it, normalize it. You know what I mean? Like, it's just this thing where that system is very good at getting people comfortable. And I think that's part of the idea of the game, is that comfort is the problem. It's the comfort there has made it so that the people in this, kaiju apocalypse or whatever are, more than fine with movie posters or, movies being made talking about, how screwed everyone is, but at least it has an action superstar or something in there, you know what I mean? I hope that answered the question. I don't even remember what the question was. This was just a big talk.
It did, and I think it gets to another question, which is I wonder how you think about, do you hope that the game is something that is primarily something that's going to get people to kind of look at these systems and understand capitalism or neoliberalism or colonialism, or do you hope that it's something that is kind of galvanizing, that it's something that people look at and are like, okay, maybe I am starting to think about grabbing the pitchforks? Do you think of it primarily as something that's this is reflective and educational, or something that is you hope kind of pushes people towards action after they get done playing?
Well, I hope so. And I think there's a moment, I think, for me when I think about action, and I think, a lot of times I think that there is this assumption that, and this, I guess this just comes a little bit from this idea of online personalities or whatever, but I think there's sometimes this assumption that unless you can, attack the top or completely, get it in one go, it's not worth doing, unless you could become the president next, in one political cycle, then it's all no hopes and stuff. But I think the thing I kind of think about is if you can activate certain individuals to take agency in their own lives around some of this stuff, maybe that's not so much a bad thing, because you never know that maybe the guy who's working a 9 to 5 at a retail job or something like that plays this, and the thing we've noticed, right, is that a lot of these players, some of them have gone on to want to do photography, right? This is the first time they've really had a chance to be creative, because a lot of times that's kicked out of you in the school system. And I think it's this whole thing where, if they're becoming photographers, but they're also getting this, message towards the end of, this is how you take photos during a protest, right? And that's gamified in a way where, you're deducted points for taking photos of people's faces. You're not doing it for money anymore. You're doing it for, shares on social media to get the word out there and to show the truth of what's happening with, the violence of the state and things like that. I think that changes. And I think, if it's this kind of thing where this 9 to 5 average Joe picks that up and then does learn photography, there's a chance that, maybe some of those messages will be something that they can take, into their own agency and do something with that. I think, one of the things I remember one of my mentors saying quite a lot is this idea of building agency over dependency. And I think that's something that, especially in sort of, for lack of a better word, millennial politics or whatever, sometimes there's this whole idea that, you just put your self-determination into an individual that you become sort of dependent on. We all probably seen people who are sort of, they see the Squad or Justice Democrats do something and they've put all this hope and energy into them, and then they've seen that nothing, or not necessarily nothing, but they see that, sometimes there's just nothing that comes out of it, when you see, say, Joe Biden or someone get in and he's basically decided that he's going to do nice capitalism from now on or whatever, where it's very, still not going to change anything about the ICE camps or, defund the police or anything like that. And you just feel very, can feel very defeated. But I feel like if there's more this thing where people can sort of get a bit of agency and start to sort of not be dependent on others, to do their own sort of action around this stuff, maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah, well, yeah. Speaking of that, in an interview you had, I think with like Indie Game, one of the indie game websites, you talk about respectful design, and both Ben and I come from like an academic background. Like we used to be in academia and things like that, and something that was really fascinating to me is this. I didn't have a chance to look too much into the respectful design philosophy, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit about it. From what I've gathered, one scholar was saying respectful design means valuing inclusivity, people's cultures and ways of knowing through empathetic and responsible creative mythologies. It means deepening our relationship to the lives of the materials that connect us to the craft of making. And something I think a lot about in the games industry specifically is, it's definitely more inclusive and diverse than it's ever been, but in the same token, it's still very Eurocentric and highlights very specific ways of knowing if we're going to continue on that path. And I'm curious, like, I think Umurangi Generation, for instance, embodies or personifies what I'm gathering from this respectful design philosophy. And I'm wondering if maybe, I think it'd be great for the listeners to hear a little bit of your perspective on that. And, obviously you don't need to go into like a philosophy lesson or whatever, but just like, what are some of your thoughts,
Yeah, we did that last question. Yeah. Okay. Well, so like, I would say, one of the things about respectful design is like, I got taught it by, Professor Norm Sheen. And he was actually one of those original design students, right? When design was first becoming a academic criteria in, when design was being introduced to the academy as this is actually a thing that is, far more than just drawing shapes or pretty pictures or whatever, right? And, I think the most dominant form of design at the moment is human-centered design, right? Which we see often in, apps and things like that, where it's that same idea. Norm, he taught me specific models of how to sort of do that, and explained, he took a lot of patience with me because it took me a while to get it. But I think it's this whole idea that, actually, like, difference isn't necessarily a bad thing, and being able to see where like we share commonality is a really positive thing as well. One of the things we used to sort of get students to do is try to negotiate difference around something. And I think it was this whole thing where, at first, because he would sort of teach me how to do things, and then he would sort of give me little assignments to do around sort of like how, how can we incorporate this into the classroom and whatnot. And at first, me being someone who did, arts during high school and did a media degree, was this whole thing of making apps that would be very, like, regardless of what you put into them, the thing that came out at the end would look so nice and beautiful, and it'd make it look so professional. And he said, nah, don't do that. What you need to do is give people the agency to fail, and not agency to fail, but more that idea of like, you need to allow people to not feel as if they're sort of, they're not being challenged on this scale of, how would you put it? Like, it's that human-centered design thing. Like we often see with a lot of these newer apps and stuff where, everything looks very slick and professional. And say, for example, I'm thinking of something like, say, with Facebook, you can now do these posts where it will automatically generate the image template for you and looks very nice. And or say, for example, like a Snapchat filter or, the stickers and things like that. And it's all very clean and professional and looks very nice. And I think, for me, thinking about this whole thing of respectful design, with the game, it was about like giving players the agency to create and not telling them which is the right way to do it. You're the one who's actually going to sort of use your own, standing and your own sovereignty there to be like, no, this is what I think's good. This is what I think's a good photo. And that meant giving them the amount of tools where they could break the game very easily. Like if they just underexpose the photo and put the contrast up to 100. It'd just be a black photo, right? And you'd still get some points for it because, scoring's generated before then. But like, haha, that's pretty funny. But the counter to that is that now that you're giving people all this agency to do whatever they want in that space, the shots that can come out are going to look even better.
I do kind of want to. So one of the things that was like one of the most impactful things for me in playing this game, especially I think the base game, is that there was a lot of freedom in taking the photos kind of throughout the game. And so I just took a mess of photos, and like a lot of them were like deeply, deeply shitty. Like I was just like kind of constantly clicking. And so that freedom felt good and it was exciting. But the most meaningful moment is that moment in the kind of the end when you're coming up on the kaiju. And my first playthrough of that moment, I kind of almost immediately, again, because I had been kind of felt conditioned to just like take a shitload of photos. And so I immediately took a photo and then the game just ends. And I was like, oh no, I want to sit in that moment more. And so like, roll credits, booted back up that scene and then got back in there. And then that time was able to just like sit around. And so, I'm hearing what you're saying about kind of giving the players freedom, but I also felt like there was a moment where when I bumped up against your kind of hard choices, that in some ways was like one of the most meaningful parts of the game for me. So maybe you can talk about that.
I think, like from what I understand, for respectful design is not a free for all either. I don't think it's this whole idea that you just all come together and you, magically, magnetically click everyone together and it's all good. I think there's usually ways of positioning, putting it in this game was another thing of saying, we know it works, We've seen what the players have sort of come up with at the end and the sort of agency that's sort of been instilled in them, after they've sort of played the game and, had the reasons to want to learn more about this, I think one of the most positive things that can come out of this game is that, like, if a, player plays the game and doesn't pick up on any of the things we've talked about in this podcast, but, a couple of years from now, the same stuff's happening, because why wouldn't it? It's not like, I think a lot of people seem to forget that a lot of the Black Lives Matter stuff started under Obama, not Trump. It obviously got exacerbated by Trump, but I don't think Biden's going to fix it. He's obviously shown through his, responses to stuff that he's not going to hold the police accountable when they do this. And, I think it's this whole thing that maybe a few years from now, because the person who played it was, let's say they were 17, and then 3 years from now they're 20, and they've got a little bit more of a grasp on how or what's going on in the world. They're not necessarily in the, gamer mentality anymore, if that makes sense. Like, just 90% of their existence is consumed by games, and they go back and they replay it, and they go, hang on, this is all really relevant again now. And they realize, maybe they pick up on some of those breadcrumbs and they go and find where that starts to connect up. And so I think, I think that's like a really positive thing that, you can do with these kind of games. And hopefully I'm still around to make another game, but like if, with the next game, the idea is to do the same sort of model in terms of this idea of leaving those little breadcrumbs and letting players sort of figure it out. Because I feel, I think it's really important now more than ever to start to do that, because I feel, and this is something I kind of think, is that, like, I think games for the longest time, especially when it comes to, the narratives and themes and stuff, they've usually just followed that, like, model of storytelling from the 80s where it's this, like, good versus evil, or that's kind of where I see games at the moment. And, like, that's why also in the DLC, I'm not afraid to, like, fling some water, like get the cup of water and just flick it towards the bigger studios there when they're very obviously trying to cash in on, this idea of liberation, or what would you call it? Like, your sort of Watch Dogs game that tries to touch on, totalitarian fascism, but at the end of the day has actually Antifa are the real fascist as its, core discussion point. Or, you've got this cyberpunk game that comes out that basically has a line in it that says not all cops are bad, and has you like actively helping the cops as a side mission, and like
I mean, it's kind of like what you were it's kind of like what you were saying about way at the beginning of the conversation, that it's kind of these big corporations, these big companies that end up co-opting political movements to make them palatable for the general public without actually developing any kind of perspective on the thing that they make their 40-hour narrative driven game about. I think Ben has some questions about maybe whatever this next game might be, but I think one thing I wanted to ask, one last thing to ask about Umurangi Generation is, as you were kind of articulating just then, the industry, at least at the AAA space, tends to have a problem with throwing narrative in terms of cutscenes and things like that at problems in order to solve the problems that they have with whatever kinds of ideology that they're talking about. You see that with things like Far Cry 6 and everything. One thing that's really interesting to me about Umurangi Generation is, in my opinion, this kind of idea of the importance of bearing witness to events that you have little control over. And this goes to what you were saying about us being millennials, or even the Gen Z folks. In a way, it seemed that the game is arguing that taking the photographs is a form of taking back some kind of power in a helpless event, or some form of activism in an event where you can't really find an out. And I'm curious, like, why was that important for you to structure the game in that way, especially in an industry that I think is very hostile to those kinds of perspectives on telling a story in the medium?
I'm thinking about that a lot, because like I think that idea of like having the game where you are in that place where you have to take photos and everything, and like bearing witness, I guess. I think this is a bit of a tricky one for me to answer, I guess the thing I kind of think about is like, it kind of comes back to what I was sort of saying a little bit earlier about that whole idea of, if you're an indie, you basically have no real risk when it comes to like, especially if you don't have a publisher, like go all in. Like one of the things I was kind of thinking about recently is like I had a chat with someone who, they were an indie developer in a country where, protesting the government could get you locked up, or could get you, you know what I mean? Like seriously harmed. And I think, the thing I kind of think about is like, if you're an indie game developer with nothing to lose and you think about the stuff a lot, you may as well just make something about it, but don't stop at the point where you think you're ending, right? I think far too often, like this is, I think, a broader thing I think about is a lot of game stories, they sort of have their, like if you ever talk to a game developer, they'll say the story is, can I just tell you the ending? And they'll tell you the ending, right? And they'll say, oh, and whatever you need to do. That's usually, in my opinion, that's the first act. And you need to go from beyond there and keep looking along and keep bouncing along with it, right? I think one thing you were sort of saying there about kind of the whole, how do these, AAA games, I guess, try to talk around that stuff. I think one of the things which I think might be like a bit of a, it's like a guilty trait of the industry, or, just the thing that's never evolved from, is like, far too often when you see that kind of thing where they need to resolve something, it's go kill the person, or, go and blow something up, right? It's usually just these very, it's these very, just destroy the thing or hit the objective, right? And I think, the gameplay side of it, I think, is something where you can do a lot more with that. Like, I'm obviously I'm not comparing myself to Hideo Kojima, but I would say one thing his game does, which is something I kind of think about and sort of tried to think about when making Umurangi, was like with Death Stranding, you often sort of hear that thing of, why would you want to play Death Stranding when you can be a postman for, and get paid for it or whatever. But like, I think the point of that is that like what you actually do in the gameplay there is part of the theme, like the idea of connecting things up again and the moment to moment gameplay of like the risk associated with doing this task comes back around to be sort of related to the theme again. And I think like with Umurangi, it's like the whole thing is, you know, taking the photos. It wasn't like, I didn't, as we said a little earlier, like we had that discussion. I didn't intend for it to be, you know, the mech stuff or the neoliberalism stuff straight away. But it turns out that like that whole process of taking photos around this is like incredibly important to it. And I think, you know, that started to lead into like where I wanted to start to, you know, position the stuff and around the levels around this idea of like resilience, right? For me, I just think about it as one of these things where you have to at sometimes also be like not positive, but you have to do things that are enjoyable, because if you're always focusing on the negative, it's very hard to keep going with it. Like, I think that's different from this idea of like comfort. It's more of this idea of you have to be able to also like breathe at some point, like in terms of breathe, but you know, breathe without turning away from the issue. Like you got to sort of be there. And I think like with this game, the idea of like it being you know, the joy of creativity and stuff being this thing that you do throughout the whole game, and you're having sort of fun, and you can, you know, hang out with your mates while you're playing, like the characters in the game, and you know, you can do that whilst also sort of being in a space that is very like fucked. I think there's like a strength and a humanity to that, because like I think the thing I kind of think about is that like the you know, whilst all these things have happened, a lot of people have found ways to sort of deal with them by like staying human at the end. Like, you know, the thing I'm sort of thinking about is like with the bushfires here in Australia, there was this like camaraderie that sort of developed around making fun of the Prime Minister, right? Like there's a really funny video clip by this Australian band called The Chats, and the guy made a song, and he's like, hey everyone, this is a song I wrote, it's called I Hope Scott's House Burns Down. He's talking about the Prime Minister, and it's just a song about, he's like calling him a fuckwit and all this, and like this chorus is just like, that's why I hope Scott's house burns down, and like just a great, you know, sort of thing where you can laugh and you can go, yeah, like this is fucked, you know what I mean? And you can have like a bit of moment to recover from it, but obviously like it's not going to go away.
I think maybe just one of the last questions for you was, yeah, maybe if you want to talk a little bit about your upcoming game and your thought about kind of what you're bringing forward from Umurangi into the next project.
The idea of the game is that it's going to be this sort of experience where it's roguelike, but not roguelike in the whole, it just randomizes the dungeon or whatever. Like it doesn't randomize the layout at all. What it does is, the roguelike element is that it's a game sort of based on that whole you know, like the movie The Thing or Alien, where there's, you know, a crew who are trapped with a monster trying to kill them, and the reason I think that's going to fit really well with having political content is because horror movies have always been quite political anyway. You know, every movie in the 1950s was about communism. You know, Alien was this movie about blue collar struggles, and you know, you had this sort of feminist element to it and things like that. You have all these movies, and like, even though it's not a horror movie, but I think there's that really great example of well, I guess it is sort of a horror movie, but it's not really, is like that movie Parasite, which came out a few years ago, and it had this very, I think, political element to it about, you know, your sort of upper class and lower class dynamic there. And I think the idea with this next game is the way we're going to do that is twofold. One is that the monster in this case is sort of like basically it's a like creation by the US as a bioweapon. The idea is that the crew of the ship are all different modern political ideologies, and the idea is to say the true horror comes from, you have all these different types of different politically minded people, and they get stuck on a ship with a monster, and now they have to work together, right? So you know, the idea is that the captain is your very like Joe Biden blue liberal who's follows everything by the book or whatever, but is basically inept at his job, really, because he's bound by the system that has put him there. He can't actually make decisions that go against the company policy, right? This idea of having these more current political ideologies and just having them all present, and then having them have to try and now do something that is like, life or death. I think, I haven't even really explained what the gameplay is going to be yet. I know what it is, but it's like one of the sort of things we're going to have in the game is this idea that, like, based on what happens, what you do, and what also the entire other crew do, depends on how the bonds are with the crew. So, like, when it comes time to those moments in the movie where everyone sits down and goes, what are we going to do about the monster, right? They're going to fight amongst one another, and then a solution's going to come out based on your interactions, but also the off-screen ones that the AI is going to sort of, like, have. So, the idea being that, like, if the captain says we're going to do something and everyone votes what they should do, then the thing that they're going to do might be totally against, like, what you're thinking. And I think that's part of the horror, is that, like, you don't have the you don't have the sort of power to choose how you want the ending to go. You have to sort of roll with, everyone on the ship is going to choose something different to me. And I think the other part around this, which I think is going to be very interesting, is this whole idea that each of the crew members is going to have a certain trait that kind of is essential for running the ship. So one of the ideas is, like, if you have the technician who's the MAGA boomer, and he decides that and he's just full of conspiracy theories, and he's like a bit insane, you kind of need him alive, because he's the only one who can, like, repair the doors, because he's the technician, right? He's the only one who can keep the lights on or make sure that the power's running. If you want your crew to be healed if they get injured, you need the medic, right? And even though the medic has, scientific racism as their, thing built into it, and they might be different in some ways, the captain, keeps the crew from sort of freaking out, because he's this mediator of the, quote, both sides, right? The warrant officer, who's this, the sort of, like, fake leftist or whatever, her ability is that if she's alive, the crew won't kill each other. So if she dies, there's a chance now the crew will try and, like, shoot each other. Like, for example, there's that moment in movies, where the person locks the person in with the monster and stuff. And that's something that we're going to try and have in this game, where, basically it'll be this little reactive sandbox where, a playthrough might only take you like an hour or two, and the idea is that every time you play, it's going to be a bit different, because of sort of what goes on. Because, like, I guess one thing I'll say about the monster, which I can talk about, is, like, the monster itself, every time you play, has different traits. And I don't mean that in terms of, like, different health boost or speed or whatever. I mean, like, no, one time you play, it'll be completely invisible and you need to wear, like, thermal goggles. And another time you might play, it can travel through electrical outlets or something like that, And it's this idea that the monster is different every time you see it. And one thing I will, spill the beans about here is the point of that is because it is this idea that it is this monster. Try to figure out what I'm saying here. It's this monster that can change what it does over time, but it still wants to do the same thing, which is kill and destroy, right? And so it's this monster of US imperialism, right? The monster is the US imperialism, right? And however form it takes when it starts the game, this is how it now flows through, and it does its certain things, right? There'll be more about that in the game. I think that's a little bit of like you go, how would that fit, right? But we've written like 60 pages about this so far, and I think we got a pretty good like idea of what the general idea is going to be. And as I said, because it's an experimental idea and we're not super, like attached to having it be, a super big hit. Like, we obviously do want it to do well, but like I think it's this whole thing where, because we can be experimental with characters and things like that, and like play in the grey there and really start to jiggle around this neoliberal system through the characters and stuff. I think there's this opportunity to really make something that's quite unique and something that's very, how would you put it, reactive. You know what I mean?
Well, I think we're been out. Do you have any last questions, or we're kind of?
I don't think so. Unless there's something that we haven't asked you specifically that you're like, man, wish they had asked me X.
I guess the thing I would just say is like, with Umurangi, like, if you are also like, having issues with any of the objectives, just look them up. It's fine. Like, I'm not like, I don't think I'm tied to the idea that, like, I do like people experiencing things for the first time themselves, and there are points where I think you can do that. But if like you are stuck, there's no harm in like looking up a guide. I think like, I think one of the things I kind of think about is sort of, like everyone's sort of got limited time, and this is like a shorter game that's quite consumable in a night or a couple of days or something like that, and I think you'll have a good time. And yeah, share your photos with us on Twitter if you can. Always love seeing them.
Hey, thank you so much for taking time out of your morning to talk to us.
Yeah, this has been great. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries.
And that was our conversation with Tali Faulkner about Umurangi Generation. This was a really exciting conversation. I think both of us were kind of enthralled by the game as we were playing it. And it was really interesting to hear about, how Tali conceptualizes his games and, making the politics so forefronted.
Yeah, and the thing that I think I'm coming away with is like I really love the idea that kind of Tali talks about of resilience, and the way that like you and I both log onto Twitter I think all the time, and often we are seeing I think some of the most horrible things that you can imagine, and it feels a lot of the times like the world is just kind of falling apart and we're just like watching it happen in real time. And he talks about this idea of resilience, of like building communities that can weather, these things that are happening, but also like finding ways to make space to take a breath, while also like not looking away, that it's something different from kind of ignoring or trying to kind of not engage with all the kind of stuff that's going on, but it's a way for kind of laughing about it or taking a breath or kind of supporting other people while also kind of staying focused around what's happening. And I really like that idea.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that was really interesting to me in relation to that was just thinking about this idea of respectful design and how, Tali does a better job of talking about it than I will, but essentially like how we can design games or how we can, navigate the various communities that we're in a way that, allows space for others, that doesn't take up space and silence others, and how we can maybe be more considerate or invested in seeing different perspectives. And the game, I think, on a fundamental level is interested in that, and people developing their own perspectives, seeing the world, and engaging with others. So I think all of that was really inspiring. It was like a kind of a conversation where I left and I was like, damn.
For me to loop it back around, so like at the top we were kind of talking about, well, why do the politics, which are like obviously kind of there and foregrounded, but you can, they're in the environment and you kind of slowly are starting to tease them out. Like, why does that work? And I think in some ways it might be this respectful design that Tali is talking about, that it's like, as a player, he gives you agency, he gives you freedom. You can take these pictures. The framing of the photos, as you kind of talk about, reinforces this, like, you're building your viewpoint or you're building your perspective within this game. And then, the kind of reality of this world is slowly kind of teased out to you. And I think that is a different way of kind of coming at politics in a game, as opposed to kind of like the visual novel situation where we're talking about like the story is kind of preordained in some ways. You don't have the same kind of freedom of movement. And so I wonder if, or I think that maybe there's a bit of a kind of contrast there, and maybe that's why there's this difference in how they hit me.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think, if anything, I was just really struck by, Umurangi Generation is a game set in the future in a place that I'm not familiar with. Like, I've never been to New Zealand or anything like that. And I don't know, it has a magic quality, I think, just in terms of when it came out, that I'm just kind of really struck by that. It feels magical in that way, that Tali was able to kind of conceptualize and deliver this game that's so much in conversation with so many of the issues that we're dealing with as a society in the United States, but also like globally. And I think we're seeing a lot of that in the industry for games right now. So if anything, I was just really excited to kind of hear all those perspectives and to see that there are like continually, whether it's Matthew or Tali or Neil or whoever, all of these kinds of burgeoning voices in the industry that are kind of doing the work in terms of making commentaries on a variety of these issues.
Yeah, and being unapologetic about it, and not having to kind of like have this smarmy like, oh, our game's not political, or trying to hide behind it. I think I really love how explicit Tali is. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I mean, if you all want to play Umurangi Generation, I think at this point it's on PC, it's on Switch. Tali said it's coming to consoles in the future, so expect it on like the PlayStation or Xbox eventually. And you can learn more about the game by going to their Twitter, which is @Umurangi Generation, and you can find it in the show notes if you're unsure of how to spell it.
As always, you can find us @OriginStory_, and you can find me @sad_radio_lad. Phil, where can people find your Twitter?
You don't think they know where to find my Twitter?
I don't know. Maybe they don't.
You can find it @3DCisco. And you can, if you have any questions, concerns, if you want to give us some fan mail or suggestions, hit us up at our email, theoriginstorypod@gmail.com. And we would really appreciate it if you all have the time or an iPhone to leave a review on iTunes, or I guess it's called Apple Podcasts now. It really helps a lot in terms of visibility and kind of getting us out there.
Thanks to Melody Hirsch for the cover arts, and as always, thanks to Ryan Hopper for that delicious music you are kind of bumping your head to right now.
And once again, thanks to Tali Faulkner for the awesome conversation. That's a wrap on this episode, but excited for the next one, and you know what that's going to be? Thursday every week. Peace.